Let's continue our Supernormal series with Metalbending, and the book Superminds by John Taylor, a scientist looks at the paranormal. And this video ends with a big twist. So John Taylor was a mathematician who wanted to prove this stuff wrong, and then started to realize, oh, it works. And so these pictures here are metal that he saw bent by children. And one way to prove the experiment was he would have the metal put inside glass spheres that were completely closed and couldn't be opened again. And then he would bring these to the children and put them not even in their hands, just near them. And the children could bend the metal through the glass without any way of touching it. So that was one way that he tested them. But this story really starts with Uri Geller, which I think is how you pronounce it, because what sparked this guy's interest and the interest of a lot of people was November 23rd, 1973, when Geller went on the BBC to demonstrate his metal bending powers. And the thing about metal bending is you don't hear about it in human history. He's the first person to ever really popularize it as something that people could do, which is funny. And he just kind of realized it randomly. He started rubbing some metal and it bent in his hand, and he realized he could just do that. And so that's what he did on the BBC. He bent spoons, he bent all kinds of things, sometimes with touching them, sometimes without touching them. And of course you can say, oh, he faked that somehow. What you can't fake is when the show is being broadcast, the next day, hundreds and hundreds of households called in the BBC and said as they watched the show, metal bent in their house, sometimes in their sight, and sometimes they would go into the kitchen and spoons would be bent, fire pokers would be bent, things that could not be bent by human hands would be bent. And so there were even some unwanted pregnancies because IUDs would get bent inside, and months later the doctor would pull it out and be like, what happened to this thing? A cop had to bring in his bent badge and explain how it got bent. And one interesting thing on synchronicity is this show was rebroadcast in Sweden months later, and still the same thing happened. People called in, even though it was not a live show. Metal got bent in their house by them unwittingly just by knowing that this stuff happened. So that's fascinating stuff. This book's also great because it goes over a lot of the early experiments from the 30s and 40s where they tried to prove ESP and telepathy by various means in a really scientific way. They have a lot of data on telepathic communication to animals. And then this guy, Vasilev, is fascinating. He would do hypnotic sleep at a distance. And with people he was already entrained to, he could order them to sleep. And they would sleep within the minute. And he could do it consistently without anyone knowing when or why he was going to order it. The last twist that I want to mention is John Taylor, about 50 years after he wrote this book, he wrote a book to debunk himself and said that all of this stuff is fakery and fraud. So even though this book is very believable, 50 years later, he didn't even believe himself. So it goes.